To understand how it started, you need to understand something about Flint and the houses he grew up in. Not only the house where he lived, the ones he visited most often. Flint was born in Winfield, Kansas, a small town and a good community. It was the kind of place where people probably knew who you were and who you were related to. He and his sister, his twin sister, Fiona, were raised by their grandparents. The father had left before either of them was old enough to remember it happening, and their mother's struggles meant she wasn't able to care properly for them, and so their grandparents stepped in and became, for all practical purposes, their parents. His grandparents were good people. Flint's grandfather managed city maintenance for Winfield. The man could fix anything, and his grandmother had run her classroom for 30 years with an expertise her former students still talked about. They loved Flint and Fiona steadily, but their house was quiet. Not sad quiet, just the quiet of a house run by two older people, where the evenings followed a predictable rhythm and things were done at the same time every day. Homework after school, dinner at 6, then TV time at 7, and in bed at 9, maybe 10 on the weekends. A house of routines, of predictability. Fiona was fine with this. Fiona liked to read. She could spend an entire Saturday in the same chair with a couple books and call it a great day. As far as Flint could tell, that never made her feel lonely or bored. Flint was not Fiona. Every chance he got, Flint went to his friends' houses. He had two best friends, Gibby and Quinn. Both of them had a lot of brothers and sisters, and parents who were young enough to still be fun. Gibby's dad could still run as fast as the kids, and Quinn's dad would sometimes shoot hoops in the driveway or play catch with them till the sun was down. And both their moms could cook dinner for an army while chasing a toddler around. At mealtime, they would put a plate in front of you without asking if you wanted to stay for dinner or if you were even hungry, because they already knew the answer. There was always someone running in or out the door, always something fun or interesting happening. He saw the jokes and laughter, but he also saw arguments and other challenges from time to time in Gibby's and Quinn's homes. But he noticed how they worked through them and had each other's backs when it mattered. He would stay at their houses as long as his grandparents would let him, and when he finally walked home, he'd feel the quiet of his grandparents' house growing with each step. He didn't dislike his home. It just wasn't how he wanted his home and his family to be. The years of childhood passed, and Fiona helped him through school more than he might have admitted. She kept him on track, talked him and his friends out of their dumber ideas, and covered for him a few times when he needed covering. His grandfather guided him too, in the steady, practical way of a man who believed the best thing you could do for a young person was show them how things worked. After graduating, Flint ended up working alongside him for the city and learned more in those years than he could have gotten from any classroom. But eventually, he felt the itch to move. And when he thought about where, one place kept coming to mind. The spring he turned 21, Flint had gone on a road trip to Florida with Gibby and Quinn. On the way down, they stopped in Chattanooga. Gibby had an aunt and uncle there who'd invited them to stay the night. As they approached the city, Flint immediately liked everything he saw. The Tennessee River curving through the city, mountains rising up on every side, trees so dense and green it seemed almost unreal to someone who'd grown up on the plains. And Gibby's cousin's house was even fuller and louder than Gibby's back home, and they made three guys from Kansas feel so welcome that on the way back from Florida, they took the exact same route just to stop there again. Gibby's cousin Brian also made a real impression on him, and they quickly became friends. Looking back on it, he realized the irony of the situation. A big spring break vacation in Daytona Beach, and it ended up that the 2 nights in Chattanooga were the highlights of the entire trip for him. So when he was ready for a change a couple years later, Chattanooga called to him, and he went. He got a job doing what he knew, city maintenance. He came out of the closet, he made friends, he built life the way you do when you arrive somewhere and decide to stay. One of the first real friends he made was a man named Victor. Victor was no stranger to Chattanooga. He'd grown up there. His family roots in this part of Tennessee went back generations. The kind of deep local history that can help give a person steadiness in a place. He'd gone away to Duke for a business degree, like his dad had, and come back in his mid-20s because he realized Chattanooga was in his bones. He was a year younger than Flint. He had brown hair, broad shoulders, and a presence that quickly earned people's trust. He could walk into a room in a suit and look like he ran the place, and then show up for a hike the next day in a t-shirt and hiking boots and look just as at home. In 2012, when Victor bought a 4-bedroom house not far from the center of the city, he told himself it was a practical investment, a place to live, rent out the other rooms for extra cash flow, and build some equity. And that was all true, but underneath that, if he was honest with himself, the house was also kind of a safety net, something secure underneath him while he finished coming out to the rest of his family, friends, and community. The day he closed on it and got the keys, Flint showed up at the door with a 6-pack and a grin. That's what Flint remembered. What Victor remembered was that Flint had showed up with his tools, and that by the time they finished a couple drinks, Flint had fixed many of the problems that had made him nervous about buying the house during the inspection just a few weeks before. Flint remembered the beer and the celebration. Victor remembered the tools and the support. The first housemates were just friends of friends, but as Victor came out to everyone, it was friends from the gay community that started to shuffle in as other housemates shuffled out. Tim was the first gay roommate to move in. Tim was tall, with an easy manner and a mind that could wander into deep focus at times. He'd start into a project, and you'd notice his mind had gone completely into what he was working on. His family moved a lot when he was young, but living near his grandparents and cousins in Chattanooga when he was in 6th and 7th grades were great years for him, and so he made his way back there in his early 20s. He eventually found a job at a plant nursery in town and was completely in his element there. Then Winston moved in next. He had gone to high school with Victor, but was 2 grades older. When he came out in college, he was the first person Victor ever saw go through that process, and here they were almost a decade later as housemates. Winston paid his rent on time and cleaned up after himself, but people usually avoided too much conversation with him due to his uncanny ability to see every cup as half empty. And then in the fall, Miguel took the next room that opened up. Miguel Rios had been born in Dallas to parents who had come from Mexico. They moved to Chattanooga when he was in elementary school, so it was home for him through most of school and college. After that, he gave New York City a shot for a while. It was a good place to come out, but he realized the crowds and the speed of life there weren't for him, so he returned with earned life experience and many entertaining stories. Miguel knew his way around a kitchen, skills he learned early from helping his mother and aunt with their catering business. He wasn't afraid to share his opinions about food, music, people, and, well, most things really. But he knew how to turn each opinion into a good laugh. By late 2013, Victor's house had changed from a safety net to a web of social activity, a place where people who appreciated connection were naturally drawn to. And Flint was the most reliable example of this. He wasn't a housemate. He still had his own apartment across town, but he was at Victor so often, crashed on the couch so regularly, and fixed so many things without being asked, that the line between visitor and resident had largely become theoretical. Victor joked that no matter how many light fixtures Flint replaced, he wasn't going to put his name on the deed. Flint replaced another light fixture anyway. They all started calling Flint the house's boyfriend. They meant it as a joke. Flint took it as a compliment. He was happy to contribute to a home that gave him the feeling he'd always loved, being somewhere with lots of stuff going on and people who looked after each other. It was shortly after Miguel moved in that Nick started coming around. Nick was short, dark-haired, and handsome. He'd grown up in Knoxville, gone to college there in Chattanooga, and had known most of the guys for years. He worked at a bike shop in town and spent every free hour he could on a trail or climbing somewhere. Though he didn't seem particularly social or extroverted, he always seemed to know what was going on with everyone. But that fall, it felt like what everyone saw going on was his latest breakup. He'd been through several breakups before, but this one hit Nick in a way unlike any of the others. He felt devastated. He'd been in a relationship which had widely been noticed because it was a 3-man relationship, a throuple, and it had come apart badly. When his boyfriend suggested that idea earlier in the year, it seemed exciting at first, but things started changing not long after. A slow but steady erosion that everyone seemed to be watching, like a reality show gone wrong for him. He increasingly felt like the least important one, and after a few months it became clear that he had simply been edged out completely. Everyone saw that he was left behind while his exes moved on with each other. Double rejection. What made things even worse was that his best friend and roommate, Michelle, was away for several months when he felt he needed her most. Sitting at home by himself seemed unbearable. So Nick started going to the bar, trying to dull the pain with drinks. More than he knew he should. Miguel worked at the bar part-time and noticed that Nick, who he'd been friends with since college, had been showing up a lot lately, and not showing up to socialize. He saw the way Nick would sit, a little too still, a little too focused on his glass, and so Miguel did a Miguel thing. He sat down, he talked, and then he told Nick he was making dinner at Victor's tomorrow night, and that he better be there. No wasn't an option. Nick went. He'd been to Victor's a time or two for different things, but something about dinner that night worked on Nick in a way he hadn't expected. The conversation moved the way it does when people are actually paying attention to each other. He knew each of the housemates from different places and in different ways, but sitting at the table with all of them helped him forget his sorrows for a while in a way that drinks at the bar hadn't been able to. As he was leaving, Tim mentioned that Flint was coming over for a movie the following night. and then Nick should come back. He came back, and then he kept coming back. What happened at Victor's house that winter was quiet and gradual and genuinely useful to Nick in ways he didn't fully recognize while it was happening, and it had an effect on all of them. Victor talked to him about growing from dependent to independent to interdependent, ideas he'd found in a book he'd read. He gave Nick a copy, certain it would help. Nick read it more than once. Tim had been through his own difficult breakups and had the practical empathy of someone who'd actually been in the water rather than just reading about it from the shore. Miguel applied warmth and food and a steady reminder that life contained things worth laughing at. Flint showed up trying to fix what he could, as he always did. Even Winston found ways to subdue his pessimism and help Nick in his own ways. And Nick made changes, real ones, the kind that stick. When New Year's 2014 came around, he made resolutions, including giving up alcohol for a year, which he wouldn't have believed possible just a year ago. Flint mentioned to him that he'd done something similar before, and he'd be there to help if needed. Tim decided he would be supportive and probably benefit as well by cutting back on his drinking too. As spring came along, the rebirth of nature around them seemed to reflect the growth and changes they were experiencing internally. Early in the summer, Tim realized the relationship he'd been in was not that healthy, and when he ended it, he noticed with the support of his friends and the increased desire to make better decisions for himself that the breakup didn't hurt in the same ways his previous breakups had. He told Nick how he understood now what Victor had been talking about, that it was smart to learn to stand on your own before you tried to stand with someone else. Nick heard that and recognized his own situation in it completely. The long days of summer soon slipped away and fall began to settle in. In September, Nick got asked on a date. At first he was nervous. He hadn't been on a real date in so long. The guys encouraged him to go anyways. But then on the evening of the date, it was Victor who was nervous while Nick went. He realized that his feelings for Nick had grown a lot that year, and worried that if he didn't take a chance, Nick might find another boyfriend soon, a boyfriend that wasn't him. Victor asked the other guys their thoughts about him going on a date with Nick. They all seemed supportive, but if you'd been inside their heads, you'd have known they wished they'd be going on the date instead. So Victor took Nick to dinner, just the two of them. It was weird for Nick in a way he didn't expect. Usually on a first date, it was with some guy he didn't know very well. But dinner with a friend who was now expressing interest felt both comfortable and exciting. After a few weeks, and several dates later, Nick mentioned to his roommate, Michelle, how well things were going. She noticed Nick was making thoughtful choices this time, and not just going along to see what happened like he always had before. A couple nights after that, Victor and Nick were walking along the Walnut Street Bridge after dinner. Victor told Nick he was impressed with how he'd learned to trust himself more, and that his confidence and independence were noticeable. Then Victor asked Nick if he'd consider something steady and committed with him. He said yes. They were good together. At first, the dynamic in the house was a bit strange as they figured out how Victor and Nick's new relationship fit in amongst the existing friendships. But soon they adjusted, and before they knew it, the holidays were upon them. Everyone noticed that this winter was merrier and brighter than the one before, and with 2015 now laying in front of them, they each sensed a new year with new opportunities and fresh experiences to come. It didn't take long for changes to arrive. Winston told Victor early in the spring that he was moving out. Victor mentioned it to Miguel and Tim a few nights later. They realized that meant Winston, the bump on the log, would be gone and his room would be available. About a half second later, at the same time, they both said, "Flint." Victor nodded. Victor made the offer to Flint the following week. Flint said he'd get back to him about it. Victor blinked. He had genuinely expected Flint to give an enthusiastic yes before he'd even finished the sentence. He mentioned Flint's reply to Miguel that evening after the others had gone to bed. Miguel said, "Flint, who is here as often as any of us and pays rent for an apartment he barely even sleeps in, said, 'Maybe?'" Victor said, "Yes, I thought that was strange." Miguel said, "Something interesting is happening in that head of his." He was right, and they would soon find out what it was. Flint had also heard a few days before that Winston was going to move, and knew Victor would probably ask if he'd want the room next. And that's when the ideas began to swirl. So when Victor asked him if he'd want the room, he wasn't sure what to say because the ideas were still in there spinning, and they continued to run around inside his brain the next few days. The following Saturday, with Winston's room freshly empty and the five of them around the dinner table, Flint took a deep breath and then opened up. First, he mentioned some videos about intentional community, videos some of them had shared and chatted about before. They showed neighborhoods designed around shared space instead of just proximity, buildings with communal kitchens and social halls, Groups of people who had decided that living alongside each other with actual intention was better than living near strangers. Flint said, "What if we did something like that here? Not just regular housemates. What if we actually arranged things, coordinated our schedules, planned dinners, shared responsibilities, lived a little more like a family and a little less like people who happen to share a kitchen and split the utility bills?" He pointed out that it wasn't so different from what they'd already did. Most evenings, whoever happened to be at the house would eat together. They'd taken road trips and gone to events as a group. He was just suggesting a little more intention around something that was already happening. He told them he'd give them some time to think about it. Tim started the group text the next morning. He called it cult creation. Some of them found this funny as well. Others were worried about the possibility of it actually going that direction. The conversations the next few days happened in pairs and in groups, over text and over the kitchen table, midday and midnight. Were the shared dinners or planned events mandatory or just encouraged? What about shared grocery fund? How would that actually work? Who decides what's for dinner? Who's cleaning? What's the exit process if someone wants to move on? How do conflicts get handled? Victor grabbed a new binder and dove into researching established intentional communities. For Miguel, his mother and his aunt had run their catering business together for years, and the two families almost functioned as one. To him, the concept felt less like a social experiment and more like something he'd grown up with. Tim thought the structure of it sounded exactly like the kind of thing he would want to belong to. And Nick came from a blended family that got along well thanks to his enthusiastic mom and thoughtful stepdad. He knew it was something that could work, but he also knew very well that some group situations don't work out. Flint followed all of it carefully, hoping they'd see the same possibilities and feel the same potential he did. A few nights later, Tim and Flint were up late, texting back and forth. Flint admitted he was worried about Nick, that the intentional community proposal might look, from Nick's vantage point, uncomfortably like something he'd already tried and been hurt by. Tim texted, "Having regularly planned dinners together wouldn't suddenly make us a quintuple or whatever. That's not what you're suggesting here, so we should be clear with Nick on that point." Flint read the word and felt something shift. Tim kept going. He texted, "That reminds me, we all know some of you guys have hooked up in the past. Since those histories are there, that issue should probably be addressed if we're going to live more intentionally or like a family or whatever." Flint stopped reading. The memories of those experiences he'd had with some of them swirled with the thought of living intentionally. And that word, quintuple, suddenly mixing them together, it had arrived as a joke, something Tim mentioned to describe what Flint was specifically not proposing. And somewhere in the space between one heartbeat and the next, it had become the most interesting word Flint could imagine. He thought about the guys. He thought about the house. He thought about every evening he'd driven across town to be somewhere that felt more like home than the place he paid rent to sleep in. He thought about what it would mean, really mean, not to just visit the house, but to belong to the people in it. The thought was enormous. It was impractical and unprecedented and one of the weirdest but best ideas he'd ever had. He lay in the dark of his apartment for a long time, looking at the ceiling, while the idea grew from a feeling into a hope. And then the hope grew into a thought. And then that thought grew louder and louder. He switched on the light and grabbed a notebook as his brain stormed. Outside, the world went on as always. The river moving through the valley, the mountains dark against the sky, the city sleeping. Inside, one man wasn't sleeping at all. The idea was lit, with the details still forming. Their world would soon change later that morning.